Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Again, it's Jason Smith with Carl Giacono. Hey, Carl, how are you today?
Hey, Jason. Nice to be here this evening.
All righty. So, we have a very special guest today. He is the host and creator of the weekly true crime podcast, The Trail Went Cold, which just passed its 10-year anniversary and is closing in on 500 episodes. And I want to have a very special welcome to Robin Warder of that podcast. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you very much, and
Robin.
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
So, Robin, this tonight you bring an interesting case to us with kind of a twist, but I wanted to start out with asking a question. Jason and I often, when we're looking at things and educating, we have complete puzzles that we teach people kind of how to take the puzzle apart and put it together to understand things about behavior. But you do these cold cases, which really are like puzzles where many of the pieces are missing. So when you got started with this, what was your motivation, impetus? Why did this attract you?
Well, I initially got interested in the whole process when I watched Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, as a child, hosted by Robert Stack, which started in the late 80s. At the time, I was most interested in the UFO, ghost, Bigfoot, paranormal stuff, but as I got older, I drew a bigger interest in the true crime stuff, especially the mysteries that still were not solved, even after they were featured on the show. And around 2016, I came with this idea thinking there's still an interest in a lot of these cases because I see them get discussed online. People try to figure out what happened. They're still unsolved after all these years. So my original impetus for The Trail Went Cold was to do one where I would cover a case that was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, do an episode about it where I not only talk about the stuff that was featured on the original TV show, but dig up additional information that you didn't learn at the show to give you a more well-rounded version of these cases. But then I decided, well, I shouldn't just limit to myself to the show. I should do just cold cases in general because there are thousands of them out there that are
Yeah.
still unsolved, which are like jigsaw puzzles where you want to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So my formula would be first half of the episode, I give all the facts of the case, and the second half, I do my theories and analysis and try to figure out what happened.
Satisfaction. Are these puzzles ever put together?
Yeah, it actually has happened quite a few times because when I started this, I thought it would be neat that maybe if two or three of these cases I featured wound up being solved, but about dozens of them have been solved the past 10 years. I think mostly due to the rise of genetic genealogy, which has allowed DNA testing to link these unsolved crimes to offenders after all these years. So I've done 7 update episodes in total where I've talked about cases that have been solved, including one that we're going to talk about on this episode later on.
Well, Robin, I think in a way these podcasts are what you're doing. It's actually a service to the police because I think I watched some of the other ones with you being interviewed, and some of the people that do these things, they come up with additional information that maybe the police weren't aware of because you get a more exposure to the public than the police do. So you might actually be, in addition to what you're saying, you might actually be providing a benefit and a help in some of the investigations.
It's true. Like, I can't say that a case has ever been solved directly because of my podcast, but I have done cases at the request of victims' family members. And that's what's great about independent shows like myself is that we have the freedom to cover which cases we want. So myself and many other podcasters give exposure to cases that don't get much in the mainstream media. And there are some cases I've covered that were in complete obscurity for years, but after they were featured on podcasts, they got more attention and more from the media and the police than they had ever gotten before.
Cool. It's cool with the families too, because, they tend to get overlooked. A lot of what Jason and I do is trying to educate people kind of related to the families and people kind of avoiding trouble in the future in those cases where something we have to offer can be prevented. But now you've been doing this a long time. Your mind must be like an encyclopedia of true crime. You mentioned you were interested in the paranormal, and of course, the first thing that comes to my mind is the X-Files. And I look at your mind probably like Mulder's files down in that basement with just overrun with all kinds of stuff. He seemed to have it in order. I'm hoping you do. But how do you continue to maintain your motivation to keep doing this, to maintain it?
Well, I am able to keep it organized. Like each of my episodes are labeled by number. I started out alternating between longer episodes and minisodes, but I stopped doing the minisodes in like 2017. And now, like I mentioned, we're nearly up to 500 episodes. And I try to organize it so that each episode, the title is the name of the victim in the story, so it helps me keep track of them. And I've yet to come to a point where I've started working on a case and then just realized, oh, I've already done this one before. So I like to keep an encyclopedia in my mind.
Yeah. Well, now today, one of the mini-sodes, I think you called it, when I watched it, number 11, Jonelle Matthews. This case kind of had a twist. Maybe you could share with Jason and I a little bit about that case as you presented it back when, episode 11.
Well, it was suggested to me by a listener who had an interest in it, and I definitely thought it was an interesting case. But I did it as a mini-sode because at the time there was limited information available. It was one where it was obvious that the girl was the victim of an abduction, but there were no suspects, no persons of interest, not a lot of evidence to work with. The victim in question was Jonelle Matthews, who was 12 years old at the time. She lived in the town of Greeley, Colorado. And in December of 1984, just a few days before Christmas, she was dropped off at home after participating in a choir at a Christmas concert. And she was alone for about an hour or so because her mother was out of town. And I know that her father had taken her older sister to a basketball game she was playing in. And when they got home, they discovered that Jonelle was gone, but a heater was running inside the living room. Her shoes were still there. And so it seemed obvious she did not leave on her own. She was the victim of an abduction, and it launched a major missing persons investigation. I know she was one of the original children to be featured on milk cartons back in the 1980s. I know that when Ronald Reagan signed the Missing Children's Act, he actually referenced Jonelle Matthews in a speech, so it was a pretty big deal. But there weren't really too many suspects or persons of interest. We just figured that someone happened to abduct her during the narrow window of time when she was alone. But by pure stroke of luck, in July of 2019, they were excavating a remote field about 15 miles outside of Greeley to install an oil pipeline and wound up uncovering some human remains. And if this hadn't happened, I think Jonelle would still be a missing person to this day. But it turned out to be her. They used DNA testing to identify her and pretty much determined that she had been the victim of a gunshot wound to the head. So she was obviously abducted. At the time, I figured maybe it was someone that the family knew who knew that she would be alone during that window of time. But it wasn't too long after that when the police, for the very first time, announced a person of interest named Steve Pankey, who lived in Greeley a few miles away from her back in 1984, but he had since moved to Idaho. But he just kept popping up in the spotlight and doing interviews with the media and on podcasts, proclaiming his innocence, even though the police hadn't even really accused him of anything yet. And they finally revealed that ever since 1984, he had been repeatedly injecting himself into the investigation, like saying that he could offer information about how she was abducted, but not giving anything concrete. So it kind of made them think that he might know more than he's letting on, but after he left town, he was pretty much forgotten about. But the new cold case detectives finally decided to go to Idaho to re-interview him and decided this guy is our best suspect. And 1 year later, he was finally arrested and charged with her murder.
Yeah, and as more comes out about his history, with the, problems during adolescence, some inappropriate sexual behavior, his rigid and controlling style, his obsessiveness. I know Jason and I looked at this and thought about this, and he had a lot of characteristics of what we would call in psychology a paranoid personality or a paranoid personality style. And it just seems like your insider, you were right on spot with thinking because of that short abduction time, it's a residential neighborhood, which is a high risk for taking somebody from a location like that, and et cetera. He probably knew the family or knew their activities and or knew the neighborhood. And it's kind of ironic. We don't know. I don't know. Maybe you do what the police actually did then, because my thoughts are, as an investigator, I would want it to go to the school and also the church and just canvass people and ask, have you had any people that are oddballs, inappropriate sexual behavior in the last year? Anybody that stands out as a little weird. Now, not all child molesters, of course, are weird. Many of them can fit in, but it would have been worth a shot to kind of do that. because he really stands out like a sore thumb in an autopsy perspective when you look back at kind of his behaviors.
Yeah, the one
Now,
incident from 1984 that really stood out to me is that a few weeks after Jonelle went missing, they were holding a church service where the priest says, "Please lead us in a prayer for Jonelle Matthews' safe return." And he got up and started making a scene, calling the priest a false prophet and getting so angry that he had to be removed from the church. And everyone thought this was weird because, as far as they could tell, he did not have any connection to Jonelle. He didn't have any connection to the family. So why is he getting so riled up about this remark from the priest? And in retrospect, it's because he knew she wasn't going to be returned home
yes,
safe and had some guilty knowledge.
yes. It's always, this was an unusual case from that perspective of what you're talking about there, with this not a need to confess, but a need to continue to put himself in situations to get caught. And my hypothesis is not because he wanted to get caught, but this stuff, whereas a good functioning psychopath does their crimes, moves on, they don't think about it again. The sexual homicide ones will think about it in fantasy to relive the actual acts, but most of them, they're not troubled at all. But part of the paranoid personality style in someone that has some anxiety and obsessive features is to continue to be troubled and run these things over. So these things continued to bother him and be preoccupying his thinking. When I looked at the case, it looked almost as if perhaps this was his first offense of that time. It didn't look like he was very sophisticated. And fortunately, because of his behavior, he likely got caught, so would never do anything again.
Yeah, like his only criminal history that he had before that is he had been charged with date rape several years earlier, but the case wound up being dropped before it went to trial. And I know he had been arrested for some minor offenses like disturbing the peace, but there was really nothing in his background to suggest that he was a child molester or a murderer. And to this day, this is the only murder that has ever been linked to him. So it may have just been like a one-off thing that obsessed him and consumed him, and he never did it again.
Yes. Likely, if he had been free, he might have done it again. But that was a long time that he went between the crime and then actually being caught. Now, it was kind of twist in this case when you talk about it, related to the offender and the perpetrator. And I'll let you share with what that was.
Well, like I mentioned, when I covered this back in 2017, there were no suspects, no persons of interest, so I never mentioned Steve Pankey's name on my original minisode. And in case you're not aware, Patreon is something that a lot of podcasters sign up for, where fans can become supporters and send you money, and in exchange, they'll get like bonus content, and you'll mail them stickers and signed cards and cards and merchandise. And I've been on Patreon for years. And shortly after Steve Pankey was arrested, I was looking at a list of patrons, and then I see the name Steve Pankey, and it's like, there's no way this can't be him. And then I look him up, and sure enough, it's his address in Idaho where he lived, and he had a profile photo. It was definitely the same guy. And he originally signed up in, I think, May of 2019, which was a couple months before they had Jonelle's remains, and he had not yet been named as a person of interest. So at the time, I had no idea who he was, so I just sent him some stickers, like a signed thank you card, as if he was just a regular fan, and then was just taken by complete shock when I found out that he was the killer in one of my cases, and likely found my podcast because I covered Jonelle Matthews' case, but apparently became such a fan that he signed up in order to donate me money and get merchandise.
Well,
I
now
guess
we've
your
gone from
podcast
the
was good enough for him to sign up. I guess he was a big fan of it, I guess.
I think genuinely he signed up for the top tier, which was $10 a month. So he wouldn't have done
Wow.
that unless he was a genuine fan.
Yeah, he liked your episode.
Like,
well, well, we've kind of gone now from the X-Files to the Twilight Zone. But then,
definitely.
but I noticed a change in your affect when you mentioned that you discovered that he was on your list. So that's my question for you. What was that like to realize that when you make the connection?
It was like a shock because I know that is something that we true crime podcasters had kind of joked about for years, the ones that do cold cases. Like, what do you think would happen if, like, the killer in some of these cases is still out there and is listening to our episodes and knows they're getting away with it because no one knows who they were? And this was pretty much the first time in the podcasting world that this was officially confirmed that a killer in an unsolved cold case who had not yet been named publicly by police had listened to an episode and were maybe like reliving the fantasy. It was almost like a different version of revisiting the crime scene. And I know that was a pretty big deal. I know you mentioned before we recorded this that you heard an interview on another show I did called Crawl Space, and
Yes.
those two guys, like within days of me posting about it on Twitter, got in touch with me and asked if they would interview me, and so I could share that experience because it was pretty big, unprecedented deal back then.
So, I find that, there's a lot of young psychologists in my day that all want to work for the FBI and analyzing crime scenes. Now, me and Jason and I have interviewed and actually worked in places with a lot of psychopaths. And, when you actually do that, you get a P.O. box. Sometimes you have a concealed weapons permit, and you basically don't want these people in your life or to know anything about you. So there is kind of the version that people have of these sorts of folks when, you're talking about them, reporting or thinking about it, in the case of some psychologists, versus you actually come in contact with people like this. When you come in contact, you really don't want them in any part of your life. Well, except your professional life. I mean, you get the P.O. box, you protect yourself in certain ways, you become more alert and aware of the environment. All of a sudden you see them everywhere. No, I'm exaggerating, but you become more aware of those kind of things and the realities of who these people are. And yes, it's a little bit shocking, frightening. I don't know if it made the hair on the back of your neck stand up or any other reactions when you discovered that this person was actually on your subscriber list.
Well, what was also crazy is that I was not the only podcast he was subscribed to because I looked at his Patreon profile and he was also a fan of some other shows about cold cases like The Vanished, Trace Evidence, Already Gone. So he even said in interviews that he was a huge fan of true crime podcasts in general, but mine was the only one that covered his particular case. So that was the big standout. And another crazy thing about that story is that about a year beforehand, before he was arrested, he actually reached out to another podcast called Unfound, which covers missing persons cases and usually only interviews family members of the victims. But he wanted to see if the host Ed Densel would make an exception and interview him because he said that the police were railroading him and falsely accusing him, and he wanted to share his side of the story. And the interview wound up being nearly 4 hours long because he just had a lot to say, and most of the time he would just kind of ramble on. And I know Ed, the host, wanted to be transparent, saying that you are a person of interest in the case, so I'm going to present all of your audio uncut, just so they say that I'm not manipulating this to kind of portray you in a certain light, and that's why the episode wound up being so long. And when Pankey was arrested and went on trial, they actually played that podcast episode in front of the jury, and Ed Densel had to travel to Greeley in order to testify because he had actually interviewed this guy before he was charged, and they wanted to know if he might have said anything incriminating to point to his guilt during the interview.
Robin, and quite frankly, I don't know if Jason's ever heard of it, but I've never heard of anything like that. You see his paranoia. He's thinking about everyone that's kind of out to get him and thinking about him where no one really is, and even he's not on the radar. We've had other kind of paranoid disorders that follow podcasts and true crime stuff. We analyzed the case with Brian Kohlberger. He's the one that did the Idaho murders. Mm-hmm. And he was a criminology major. And of course, he followed that and he read things with Ted Bundy and watched things about Ted Bundy. So you will have people that kind of do this almost as a way of grooming and getting better at their trade. But it's very unusual to have someone this troubled that will, continue to interject themselves into things and put themselves at risk. Some will frequently follow the crimes, may show up, but not to the extent of this particular individual.
And this was the only reason he was charged. This was a very circumstantial case because there was no DNA, no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses. But the reason that they had enough evidence to take him to trial is he kept revealing details about the crime scene, which were not released publicly, and he should not have known unless he was the offender. And the biggest one was that the perpetrator had apparently stolen a rake from the Matthews garage in order to cover up the footprints that he had made in the snow going up to the house and running away. And the police were careful not to release this to the media. But apparently, he was during an interview with the police, he dropped that piece of information, and that made them think, okay, he has to have inside knowledge. Otherwise, he shouldn't have known that. And if he had just kept his mouth shut and stayed under the radar, he never would have been charged.
Yeah, the more you lay it out on the table, the more perplexed I become about his behavior. I understand it in the perspective of his personality style, but a good offender or a good criminal would never do anything like this.
Yeah, that's what just makes me think like this was a one-time thing and he just had no experience with it. And maybe he didn't want to face the consequences, didn't want to go to prison, but he almost felt like he had to get it off his chest somehow in order to like tell people what he did. And it's still a big mystery what his motive was because he has never confessed. He's always maintained his innocence even after he was convicted. And the Matthews family has always sworn, we don't know this guy. We never knew him before. And the only real connection is that he once went to the same church as they did, but they still don't know why he decided to target Jonelle and do this.
Well, I don't, I say this half in jest and half seriously. Maybe at some point in the future, he'll be contacting you for
You
an
never
interview.
know. I mean, I don't
Or
know if he can
finally,
email me in jail, but he would do that if he could.
and they
Yeah.
have the ability to do that. So that's a positive. Yeah, you may finally, come clean and want to do it on your podcast. That would be an interesting to get some motive behind it.
Yeah, like I would really like to hear him make a confession and admit why he did what he did. But I remember when he went on trial, like his defense attorney's argument was that he's just obsessed with true crime. He's obsessed with this case and wants to talk about it so much that he wound up falsely implicating himself. But they said just because you're a true crime fanatic doesn't mean you're a murderer. But obviously the jury didn't buy it.
When I think wasn't there a mistrial initially and he had a second trial?
Yes, like I think the vote was something like 9-3 in favor of conviction the first time around, but they couldn't reach a verdict. But I find it interesting that his defense attorneys changed for the second trial because I think his first one says, I can't go through this again because I have a feeling he was a nightmare as a client because he could not keep his mouth shut. He was very combative with his attorney and was even briefly considering the possibility as acting as his own counsel for his second
There you
trial
go.
until they found him a public defender. But he was pretty much his own worst enemy, it sounds like.
Well, that see, you say you use key words like combative, probably arguing with his attorney, thinking he knows best, thinking he's wronged. He has to say something. You get people that are paranoid sometimes that are paranoid schizophrenic. They may be in jail for stealing a loaf of bread, but they're not going to admit to it. They're going to take it to the Supreme Court and they end up doing years in jail because they can't cooperate with their attorney. That's a classic paranoid style. Well, for you, how has this changed things for you at all, or made you aware that you would do something differently, or has it caused any impact on you?
I mean, I don't, it doesn't really make me fear for my life because I live in Canada, and I think that the odds of someone like coming across the border from somewhere like Idaho to come after me are pretty remote. But I can see how it would put podcasters on edge because I know some of the other podcasters I know are boots to the ground where they will like go to the places where these crimes took place, interview people, and try to like break the case wide open. And they could potentially be in a situation where a suspect decides to come after them, a suspect that they never even knew about before because they feel that they're being threatened. So it is kind of opened your eyes and made you realize that you are doing real cases involving real people and you just never know who's listening.
Wow, Robin, yeah, that's an important insight. The more you put yourself out there, like you said, boots to the ground with people, you increase the likelihood that someone could potentially fixate on you for whatever reason. It's kind of like in this case where they said, well, the family didn't really know him. He didn't know the family. But see, in an offender's mind, knowing someone is quite different than you and I sitting here and chatting as we're doing now with Jason. It's fantasy. So they may see you just in passing and form a connection to you that you, when nothing that's a fault of yours and nothing you would suspect they would do.
That's what I've always wondered because Janelle's Christmas concert was videotaped, and I know that sometimes they would show footage of it on the news saying, do you see anything in this video? Maybe recognize anyone in the audience who looks suspicious. And I've always wondered, could Steve Pankey have attended that concert and fixated on her and then just decided to follow her home?
Yes, you see, his motivations are probably really complex. I know in one of the things I read about it, it said something about that he had said to his wife, "Well, I didn't do anything to this girl or something because she looks so much like you." So let's say a piece of it, he's angry at his wife and they have conflicts and he can't resolve it because of his interpersonal skills, which are lacking. So he's got aggression towards them. Some people hypothesized he may have aggression towards the church and the way they treated him.
Yeah, like it could be any reason. I know that his marriage was a very unhappy one. He was very abusive and controlling towards his wife, and he had a young son at the time who eventually became completely estranged from him. And his ex-wife, they later divorced. She would become the key witness against him at his trial because she recounted a lot of the suspicious things he did right after the disappearance took place because apparently they were planning to spend Christmas at home, but the day after Jonelle goes missing, he suddenly decides we're going to go to California and spend Christmas with my parents, and just showed up there uninvited. Like his parents were apparently completely surprised that he just decided to drop by, but it seemed like he was trying to fabricate an alibi for himself, get himself out of town right after the crime took place. And as they were driving home, she said that he was telling her to obsessively check the radio to see if she could find any news on the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews, which she found odd because they didn't know this girl. And I'm not even sure how he found out about it because this was 1984 before the internet, where news did not travel as fast. So she found it very odd that he's suddenly obsessing about this missing girl that he shouldn't even know about in the days following her disappearance.
Well, sometimes with
The
offenders,
alibi
go
and
ahead,
the
Jason.
alibi too, right? They said he was at home watching TV or something. The wife said something like that we didn't even weren't allowed to watch TV or something. Wasn't that kind of that the night of or whatever it was?
Yeah, he has always said that he was at home watching TV with his wife and son. His wife doesn't really recount it. She just remembers him coming home, but doesn't remember what time. But she said that part is a lie because he was a very religious guy who did not like them listening to music, watching TV. So she's like, "There's no way we would have been watching TV that on that particular night because we were forbidden from watching it."
See, with a guy like this, he just sometimes with killers when they fantasize and they kind of project parts of themselves onto people, and then they treat the other people like those parts of themselves they're trying to destroy. And with this kind of guy, the problem with that behavior is after a while, because it's the problems and conflicts are all inside of you, they'll come back to haunt you again. So it's a temporary reprieve or release. Let's say that he might have molested the girl and did other things to her, then he shoots her and kills her. In a way, in this case, he's killing a part of himself, but that part of himself that's troubled and disturbed isn't going to go away. It's a temporary relief. So it's just very sad for the family. And I know I watched some things about it where the family kind of seemed to have some closure with finally finding the body, what was left of it, and discovering that she was dead.
Yeah, because I guess we technically don't know if she was molested or raped because she was skeletal remains when they found her, but I'm guessing that's probably was his motive for doing it, and that he maybe took her to that field and molested her before he shot her. But at least they finally like knew where she was and like gave her a proper burial. And they I think the family had moved to Costa Rica and were living as missionaries, but came back to the United States to attend Pankey's trial. And they were very disappointed that he still maintained his innocence and didn't say why he did it, but at least they know that he's locked away and they finally have a conclusion.
And I think it was pretty interesting too. The biological mother too tried to reconnect. I guess she was 13 at the time, and later on, and then I guess at some point the police were like thinking that she was a suspect or something like that as well. And then, but they didn't obviously approach her or anything like that. But I guess she later on, the biological mother tried to reconnect, and then she found out about the murder.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that Janelle was adopted by the family because her biological mother was only 13 years old when she gave birth to her and had to give her away. And the police covertly watched over her, wondering could she have traveled to Colorado and kidnapped her daughter. And they were satisfied that she didn't do it and ruled her out. But because of privacy reasons, they couldn't actually tell her that her biological daughter had been kidnapped until many years later when she said she wanted to reconnect reconnect with her daughter and then find out that she went missing like a decade earlier. But I
Yeah.
guess on the bright side, she became good friends with the Matthews family and they connected over this whole thing.
Yeah, Robin. Just very tragic. Any kind of a summary or other things you want us to know about the case, how it impacted you, perhaps?
Well, one other interesting thing about Steve Pankey is that he would become the victim of a tragedy himself because his own son Carl was murdered during his 20s by his estranged girlfriend. It had no connection to this case at all, but a key piece of evidence that his ex-wife Angela testified to at the trial is that when they had a wake for their son, he bent over his casket and says, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonelle Matthews," which makes me think that he was feeling he was being punished and that karma hit him and took his son because of this horrible thing he had done. But at the time, Angela is like, "Why are you mentioning this missing girl at her son's funeral? What's this got to do with anything?" And I think that was just one of the many red flags that was making her think that, maybe my husband has a dark secret and maybe he was more involved in this case than he's letting on.
Yeah, certainly.
Oh, yep. And he so he received 20 years to life in prison. So he's currently incarcerated somewhere in Colorado, correct?
That is
Uh,
correct, yeah.
yep.
So the earliest he can get parole, he would be 91 years old. So I don't think there's much chance of him being let out.
Yes, yes. And hopefully, maybe one day he will let us know what his motive was, and so they can get even more closure. But it was a tragic. At least it had a little bit more information for the family to understand and to find the remains as well.
All these cases are tragic, Robin. They're all, how do you have gradients of bad to worse? They're always the worst when there are children involved, it seems.
Yeah, I try to space out those ones because some of my listeners tell me I automatically skip any of the episodes you do about missing and murdered children just because
Ah,
they're so traumatic. And there are even some cases where I won't touch, where ones where children have gone missing after being raised with an abusive family or something like that. So I have to be in the right mindset before I tackle a cold case involving a child.
how many more years are you going to do this?
Well, as long as I can. I mean, that's probably not a good thing for the world, but there is no shortage of unsolved cold cases out there, so I will never run out of cases to feature on my episodes. But I still have a lot of people listening to my show, and they seem to like it, and I'm seeing cases that I've covered get solved all these years, so it's definitely worthwhile to keep doing it for as long as I can.
I certainly hope you'll come back on Arts again. I know one of the cases you covered, Cindy James, is a very fascinating case for a number of reasons. And certainly, if Jason and I can ever help you when you're sorting things out, looking at some of the personality factors that contribute to a specific offense, please contact us and let us know.
Oh, I definitely will. Yes, I've listened to your show a couple episodes before I did this, and it's very insightful. And who knows? I hope this doesn't happen, but I hope I don't find out that another Patreon subscriber of mine is the killer in another case I've covered. But if that happens again, I will definitely contact you.
Well,
Yes.
Robin, we wish that there wouldn't be any more unsolved cases and any more murders, but I guess that's not very realistic.
No,
So hopefully they don't end up subscribing to you.
exactly. Yes.
Just have one more question before you go, Robin. Have you gotten through all the unsolved mystery cases that haven't been solved on your podcast, or there's still more out there?
Still a whole bunch more. Like
Okay.
I've maybe a couple dozen have been solved, but I've done hundreds, so I don't think there's much chance of all of them being solved. But that would be a good thing. It would be great to
Yeah.
see as many of them get solved as possible.
Yes, definitely.
The
So,
truth is out there, I guess.
Yes.
well, Robin, thank you again for joining us. It has been a pleasure. Everybody, there will be a link to Robin's podcast in the description. So if you want to follow and subscribe to that, please do. As well as for everybody that wants to like and subscribe for our podcast, you can do that on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. And I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time. Take care,
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you.
Thank you.